boom, bang, bang, boom, boom, bang.
What is going on, guys? So today we are back with another video. Today we're actually going to be building a budget Jungle Cup team, and there's some things that have changed since we actually last built a Jungle Cup team. So we're going to kind of revise the format a little bit, and we're actually going to look into a different way of building a team, and then we're going to put some restrictions on ourselves, mainly a 60,000 Stardust team, a 120,000 Stardust team, and a 180,000 Stardust team, just for the heck of it. I just think it's kind of fun. But really fast, I do actually want to plug something that's actually coming up. When this video goes live in just it should be roughly 12 hours from when this video goes live, I will actually be on a podcast with a host of other panelists that we're just basically going to have a roundtable talking about PvP. With all of the changes that have come through recently, it's probably going to be a very interesting one. A quick few details about it: it's going to be called the Lord Up Pokemon Creator Roundtable Series PvP Round 2. The live stream does go live Saturday, July 13th, which is the day that this should be going live, at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So depending on where you live in the world, it could be a little bit different, of course, but it is going to be live at 10:30. There will be a video released shortly after. It says that it should be the following day on July 14th. And just a quick skim through all of the panelists. We're going to have Gemma Banks, Jay Pharmacus, Call Me Jake, myself, Hero Venge, Ghost Stadium, and Brampton Pokemon League. I seriously hope I didn't butcher anybody's name. Basically, we're just going to get into a podcast and we're just going to talk. There's an itinerary, but none of us have filled it out, so it's just TBD on what we're going to talk about at this point. I'm sure it'll get filled in before this video goes live, though, but either way, I highly encourage you guys to come by and support your favorite PvP content creators, because a lot of us are going to be on there, whether I'm your favorite or one of the other guys are your favorite. Definitely come out and show some love for your favorites, and that's it for my little plug here. So now, let's actually get into the meat and potato of our video here. So basically, the Jungle Cup on a budget was a whole lot easier than I initially expected. This thing was... okay, so I basically went through, and the way that I do these is I actually go through and I write down on my paper all of the Pokemon that have a 10,000 Stardust cost for their charge move. I have a 50,000 column, and then I have a 75,000 column. I don't even bother with the 100,000 because it's insanely hard to really do that with these restrictions, and plus none of them this month were really worth it. So I have my 3 columns, and I basically go through and I start with the 60,000 team. That allows me to buy 1 charge move per Pokemon if I have all 6 Pokemon at 10,000 for their second move. This entire video will not take into account catching at a decent level, powering up the Pokemon. This is just for buying the second move, because if we took into account all of the other crazy things, I mean, we could probably figure out, like, I guess if we wanted to, we could say on average it would take this many power-ups to power up this Pokemon, and the average level that you're gonna catch this Pokemon at would be blah blah blah. But that's min-maxing a concept that isn't really necessary, in my opinion. So just looking at our second charge move cost here, we're gonna go with a 60,000 team, which, like I said, if every single Pokemon on this team was a 10,000 cost, we could buy a second charge move for every single Pokemon. You could buy one Pokemon's second charge move if it costed 50,000 and another at 10,000, and then just have no charge moves for the rest of your team. There are a few variances in this specific column. If we move over to the 120 though, it does open up a little bit more, because you could do quite a few combinations, similar to like 2 50s and 2 10s. You could do a 50 and the rest 10s and save yourself some dust. You don't necessarily have to hit the 120, we just try to keep it under. And then in our last one, which is the 180, we do have a lot of actual free reign here. We could do 175 and the rest 10s. We could do 2 50s and the rest 10s. I mean, you can kind of like play around with it and just kind of figure out which way that you'd want to go with it. So I do have a team set up for all 3 of these, and I do have a couple of interesting things to show you guys. But really fast, let's go through our format that we're going to be following to actually complete these teams here. So basically, I have it written out that we have 6 slots for our team, of course, and we do have each slot named as what kind of role it's basically going to be. So in slot 1, we do have our king. The king is basically Vigoroth. I mean, there's no other way to put it. We're just going to follow with Vigoroth as just a guaranteed needs to be on the team, and I'll show you why in just a second. Next, we have a slot 2, which is actually our flyer. I still do think that even though the way that this month is shaped up, the flying type is still pretty strong. It does handle a lot of the grass types, it does handle a lot of the bug types, and it really does still cement the fact that it kind of needs to be here. In slot 3, we have our queen. Yeah, since Wigglytuff has made an appearance, I would say that Wigglytuff is going to be pretty nice for the cup. Of course, I'm still a firm believer that no Pokemon is completely necessary. If you wanted to run a complete anti-meta team, you could just do like 2 anti-kings, 2 anti-queens, and 2 anti-flyers if you truly wanted to. Just as long as you have all of your other bases covered, that would work out just fine. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to assume that Wigglytuff is somebody that you want to run, considering that it's brand new, just coming off of having charm. It's hot, it's crazy, it's a cool commodity at the moment. So we're going to assume that Wigglytuff is going to be in your team. Next, in our slot 4, we do have our anti-king. So this, in my original team building video, I said that I personally don't care to have a grass type. That's just my opinion. I think that if I can eliminate one Pokemon that has that weakness to the flying type or to the ice type or whatever, then I will try to take that avenue if I can. As long as I still have a Vigoroth counter, I don't necessarily believe that it has to be a grass type. Like, if I chose Breloom there, I think Breloom would fit just fine. If I chose Heracross there, Heracross fits just fine. It doesn't have to be a grass type necessarily, as long as it just takes out Vigoroth. I think that's the main point that I'm trying to get across with this slot. Our next slot that we have here is our anti-queen, and I mean, I guess you could say that's a pretty bold statement, but it is in purple because our queen is going to be running the fairy typing, and purple is for poison. So basically, as long as we have a strong poison on our team, it definitely does hurt the Wigglytuff in a lot of scenarios. So I definitely tried to pick Pokemon that were going to be either resistant to Wigglytuff or straight up poison, which, I mean, it also resists it, but basically we just want a resistor to the fairy type damage. That's all I'm trying to say with the anti-queen. And then on the last slot, we do have our anti-flyer. This could be a rock type, this could be an electric type, whatever. As long as it's an anti-flyer, I think this is pretty solid. Basically, king, flying queen, anti-king, flying queen. Easy peasy, dunzo, all right? So to get some help with building our team here, we actually are gonna use our coverage checker, which I did feature in the last team building video. Basically, it's gonna be the same thing, except I did spruce it up just a little bit. Kind of another kind of segment that you guys have asked me for in the past, and I kind of wanted to try to hit on that a little bit today. So it does have a little bit more of an update, but we'll go through those as we go through the video. So you'll notice that you do have an extra page, but we'll get to that page in just a second. We're just going to click on the full party page to start off with here. You can see it looks very similar to the last time that you probably used it, except we do have some little bit of changes here. So really fast, I'm just going to delete all of the thingies here. All right, so in our first slot here for our 60,000 Stardust team, keep that in mind, we're only spending 60,000 for the dust on this team. So our first slot, and you guys may think this is kind of a cop-out, but I do think that this is pretty necessary, especially to keep up with our format here. We're gonna go with the king, and we're gonna go with Vigoroth, and Vigoroth here, the reason that I'm choosing Vigoroth is because I honestly think that you could get away without having to buy his second move. The fact that Body Slam is going to be preferred in like 99% of the matchups. You're very seldomly gonna need Brick Break, and you're very seldomly gonna need Bulldoze, and if you're on a budget, that 75,000 Stardust is a pretty hefty cost anyways. So let's just assume that we're not gonna buy that. If you already have it, that's fine. If you don't, I don't think you necessarily need it if you're on a budget. So our first Pokemon there, Vigoroth, we do see that we have all of our coverage out listed there. We're going to be weak to fighting. We're going to have a resistance towards the ghost, which is great. So now in our second spot, if we're going to fill out our flyer here, I definitely think that one of the best flyers that we could possibly have here is going to be Knocked Out. So Knocked Out only costs 10,000 for the second charge move, and it's just all around amazing. We could easily do something like Wing Attack, Sky Attack, and Nightshade and be just completely fine. Of course, only 10,000 Stardust is an amazing budget option there. And as you can see, we do have our coverage checked out there. We do have a resistance to ground. We do have a resistance to bug. We are going to take super effective damage from rock, electric, and ice, and we do have a resistance to the grass as well, so already shaping up pretty nice there. Now in our third slot, if we have our queen, we're basically going to go with Wigglytuff here. So as you can see with Wigglytuff, I mean we've already done a deep dive on it. She's insanely powerful. It's insanely powerful. I don't want to gender stereotype there. It's insanely powerful for what it is, so definitely gonna take a Wigglytuff into this cup here. As you can see, we do have a weakness to poison, we do have a weakness to steel, and that's gonna come in handy for our anti-queen in the back there. So those are our first three slots. Next, moving on to our fourth slot, we're gonna have our anti-Vigoroth, which is basically either gonna be a grass type or a counter user. For this team, I think that one of the better options, and you could either go with what I'm going to say, or you can go with the evolution, it doesn't matter. Basically, Ivysaur or Venusaur will be perfectly fine here. Either one is up to you. I personally like Ivysaur. I personally like running Vine Whip on it. I understand if you want to run Razor Leaf, completely understand, but either way, I like to run Vine Whip personally. So as you can see with Ivysaur there, we do have that resistance to the fighting, we do have a weakness to flying, we also do have that weakness to fire, which is not going to be too big in this cup, and then we do have two more weaknesses to psychic and ice, while we do have a couple of resistances there as well towards the bottom. So slot number 4 looking pretty nice. In slot 5 here, we do have our anti-queen. So basically we can either choose something that's steel type or that's poison type. For this, I actually chose Beedrill as our option for the poison type here, which I think Beedrill is a really nice option. It's only 10,000 for the extra move, and with Poison Jab, it's going to come out of the gate doing massive damage, and then it's going to be all around super fast with X Scissor. It's going to be a great little package for Beedrill. I definitely think that because Wigglytuff being so much more prominent now, has boosted a lot of the steel type and the poison type Pokemons up even higher in terms of usability. I definitely think they have an even bigger role than they did previously. So slot 5 out of the way, let's move on to slot 6 here. Basically this is going to be an anti-flyer, so either rock type or electric type. I say let's take the best of both worlds. I say let's take the best of both worlds there. We're going to go with the Golem. We're actually going to choose the Alolan Golem there. As you can see, with our Golem and our Beedrill added, we do have some more resistances and some super effectiveness kind of sprawled out there. Now the important part, what's been added to this spreadsheet is if you scroll all the way to the right, you can actually see the results column. In that results column, it's basically going to tell you what your entire team of 6 is going to be weakest to. So basically what we're going to look at here is you can see that the rock type is going to be a big weakness for us. We average out amongst all 6 of our Pokemon to have a bigger weakness to rock than, for instance, that we do to ground. Even though Golem has the highest weakness to ground, you can easily stick Golem on a team with Knocked Out to kind of cancel out those ground type moves if you were to need to. There's not too many ground type moves running out there, but that's just an example. So as you can see, one of our best typings that we have a big resistance up against is actually the Ghost type. With all of our Pokemon, even basically it's just going to be these first 3. Vigoroth, Knocked Out, and Wigglytuff all carrying that normal typing is going to make the Ghost type super ineffective here. But basically, Ghost type is going to be the best one to resist up against. And you can kind of see that Rock type is going to be slightly a problem. And Psychic and Ice are also tied for a problem as well. So where does the rock type weakness come from? Well, Beedrill has a pretty big weakness to rock, as well as Noctowl having one as well. So we got to kind of pay attention. We don't possibly want to put both of those guys on the same team unless the opponent isn't running a rock thrower. And keep that in mind, because when we talk about the next section, after we get through all of our teams, we're going to talk a little bit about that as well here. So let's actually look at the Psychic and Ice here. The Psychic is going to be super effective up against Beedrill and Ivysaur, so we kind of want to watch out, possibly not put both of those if we see a prominent Psychic type move on the opposite team. Maybe Venomoth would probably be a big one to watch out for there, considering it probably will carry Confusion, so you possibly want to stay clear of that. And then of course the Ice type is going to ruin both Noctowl and Ivysaur here, so we possibly want to steer clear of those if we do see a prominent Ice user on the other team. Not too many of those running around, but you know, Wigglytuff also does have that Ice Beam, so you gotta kind of be wary of that as well. So I think that this is a great tool just to kind of help you visualize what you're going to be super weak to. So with all that said, our first team, our budget was 60,000. We actually made it out with 50,000 dust. So 50,000 Stardust, holy cow, that's pretty insane. Yeah, it's just for our second moves. It doesn't take into account powering it up and all that. I know, but hey, that's still pretty good. So moving on into our next team here, we're going to shoot for 120,000. We're going to kind of keep it underneath that. So I know this is going to be a cop-out for a lot of you guys, but we're going to stick with Vigoroth. With Counter and Body Slam, there's no reason that we really need to buy that extra move. Like I said beforehand, it'll be fine just with that, especially if you're on the budget. You might as well just not even worry about it. You don't theoretically need it to win that many more matchups. So Vigoroth we're going to keep in slot 1. For our flyer though, we're actually going to switch it up because I do spend some dust in another area. I had to find an area to save some dust here, and I think I found a really nice Pokemon to do that with. If we go with Pidgeot, one of the reasons that we're going to go with Pidgeot here is because A, it's going to actually beat the Noctowl, which is pretty good, and it'll still do basically the same job as Noctowl while beating Noctowl. It just won't do as good as Noctowl up against some of the other Pokemon. So while it's not quite as good, it is really good at taking out the Noctowl itself. Plus, we're actually going to be able to save 10,000 dust because the two fast moves that are preferred for Pidgeot are both flying type moves. So basically, I just want to go with the one that's actually going to be more useful or even better or faster or more punishing, whichever one you kind of prefer. I technically say that Brave Bird would probably be better, but it's probably up for debate on which one is truly better. Definitely want to go with just one charge move there with Brave Bird. I think you'll be doing just fine. Now in our third slot here, I'm also going to cop out and just say Wigglytuff because it's only 10,000 dust. It's just fine if we have both charge moves there. So why not? It's the queen of the cup at this point. Let's just keep it like that. But in our grass slot, we are actually going to change something up here. We're actually going to go, instead of Ivysaur, we're going to spend a little bit of dust here. And here's the point where I started to kind of run into a problem. Basically, when I did the 60,000 dust team and then had to transition into 120, I was thinking to myself, well, what is a flyer that's better than Noctowl? Debatable Pidgeot, not really better than Noctowl, but can beat Noctowl. And then I got down to the grass or the anti-Vigoroth option, and I was like, what is a better anti-Vigoroth than Ivysaur? What is a better grass type than Ivysaur? Debatable, because Ivysaur has its matchups, whereas other grass types have their matchups. The other anti-Vigoroths are going to have their matchups. It's just kind of awkward. So this isn't necessarily to say that I would choose Victory Bell over Ivysaur. This is to say that if I had the dust to spend, I think Ivysaur will do just fine here, but if I wanted to run something else and I had to basically spend 50,000, I would personally go with Victory Bell here. With Victory Bell having Razor Leaf, Leaf Blade, and Acid Spray, I definitely think that it's a big asset, especially Acid Spray being such a huge move. Up against Wigglytuff, I mean, Acid Spray's not going to put out a ton of damage, but it is going to chunk away at that defense pretty nice. So it could be good for that. It could set you up if you're in an unfavorable matchup to come in with your next Pokemon and possibly hurt the Wigglytuff a little bit more there. Outside of that though, Razor Leaf is going to do an insane amount of damage up against a lot of different Pokemon. It's pretty much just going to eat away at that Vigoroth very slowly. Having that poison type is going to help resist some of the damage from the Vigoroth there. So I definitely think that Victory Bell is going to be a pretty nice pick here. Next one, we're actually going to keep our Beedrill, and the reason for that is when I was looking at the poison type, it was kind of hard to say that anything was better than Beedrill at this point. I did try to throw Venomoth here, but it didn't really work out with the way that I wanted to spend my dust. I definitely wanted to save dust here and just keep the Beedrill at 10,000 because in our next one, our anti-flyer option, I did switch it up and I actually, instead of going with Golem, I ended up going with Cradilly. So what Cradilly does is it actually helps remove some of the super duper weakness that Alolan Graveler does carry, but it's not super about that. It's not as much about that as I want it to seem. Basically, Cradilly opens up a little bit more because we're not actually using a rock type fast move. We're actually going to be using Infestation, Stone Edge, and Grass Knot. It does give us an extra move in the grass area, but it also gives us Stone Edge, which is a really punishing move up against the flyers. And then Infestation is just going to help us gain tons of energy super fast. Plus, it actually does pretty good up against the grass types. So, if we actually take a look at all of our weaknesses and our resistances here, you can see we don't have quite the huge weakness to 3 different typings. Whereas in the 60,000 we had a weakness to the rock, we had a weakness to ice and psychic. In this one you can see that basically ice is going to be our biggest weakness. But there's not too many ice types running around in the cup. There's not too many ice moves that are out there. Besides Wigglytuff having Ice Beam, there are a couple of others, but nothing too prominent. That's actually pretty good. Although we do have quite a few other weaknesses that are right behind. Psychic is pretty crazy. Fire, not super prominent. Steel could be a problem. Then we do have rock, which could be a problem, and flying could actually be a problem. So we don't have as crazy of weaknesses to start off with, but we do have a little bit more of a weakness just spread out, if that makes any sense. So depending on how you like to build your team, you can kind of do it whichever way you want to there. But so with all that we spent, 0 on Vigoroth, 0 on Pidgeot, 10 for Wigglytuff, 50 for Victory Bell, 10 for Beedrill, and 50 for Credilli. We end up with exactly 120 there, so we still stuck to our budget, which is pretty nice. So moving on to our last team here, we do have the 180,000 Stardust team. So this one is kind of like your spend as much as you want sort of thing, but not really, because we need to keep it under 180,000. You could splurge on the Vigoroth, and originally that was my plan here, but I kind of decided to go against that. So the reason that we go against that is because I decided to spend that dust a little bit differently. We're actually going to keep both Vigoroth and Wigglytuff in here. We're actually going to change, instead of Pidgeot, I do think that Noctowl is the better bird here, so we are going to switch back to that. This one is kind of our like no bars held, we're basically going balls to the walls here. We're actually going to end up keeping our Victory Bell here as well, but here's an important change. Instead of Beedrill, instead of running a poison type here, I wanted to switch this up. And I want to go with Fortress. And the reason for Fortress being here is because fire typing is pretty much non-existent in the cup. You don't have to worry too much about the fire type moves running around. And when you don't have to worry about that, Fortress can kind of just run around and do whatever he wants to because he only has that one weakness, even though it's a super duper weakness. He's basically squared away there. So in our last slot here, I actually do think that even though Credilli is an interesting pick, I think for this specific team, Alolan Golem actually does make a little bit more sense for me. And the reason is because when we look at our ending numbers here, we only have one typing that's a like hardcore weakness, and our worst typing to go up against is the fire type. But like we said, there's nothing really in the cup that's going to be utilizing a lot of firepower, so we're basically free to roam here. Our next closest one is the ground type. And out of the ground type moves, there's not too many of those either, so we're pretty much free reign there as well. And then after that, we do have a weakness up against ice and fighting. And then that's pretty much it. So, I mean, that's actually really interesting that we can spread out those kind of weaknesses and resistances to where basically, if we pushed it all towards the fire type here, we're basically going to have a lot of neutral matchups, or if we choose our Pokemon right, we can just have a lot of super effective while receiving neutral damage, which actually ends up working pretty well. As far as the best typing, of course, to go up against would be the Ghost type here. As you can see, we do have the biggest resistance towards the Ghost, but that's neither here nor there, considering not too many of those type moves are going to be running around. But I mean, in general, that's pretty freaking sweet. I think that that's a really awesome spread for a team. So now, let's actually get on into the next part of what we're going to talk about today, which is something you guys have asked me for in the past. We're going to actually build some teams of 3 here. So in this specific sheet on the coverage checker, we basically do have just 3 Pokemon here. And this is a very similar thing. If you actually go on PvPoke, they have a team builder. And theirs is probably a little bit more fleshed out and probably more visually appealing rather than just a spreadsheet. If you want to use that, that's completely fine. This is just a quick snip kind of version. I literally just neutered this page into doing this. But something to help me kind of convey what we're talking about here. We're going to start with our 60,000 team. And the problem with doing something like this, and what I initially had reservations on, is I need to know the opponent's team before I can say, well, this is the most optimal team of 3 to start with. because without knowing my opponent's team, I'm basically just guessing what the opponent is going to run, or I'm choosing the Pokemon that are going to be the most neutral or the most resistant to what I expect the opponent to run. So what I decided to do here is actually take our 3 teams that we just built and just kind of put them against each other. So if our 60,000 dust team, which is where we're going to start, actually ends up going against our 120,000 dust team, here's what we're going to do. So just for some clarity, our 120,000 team, Vigoroth, Pidgeot, Wigglytuff, Victreebel, Beedrill, and Credilli is what we're actually going to go up against. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually just rebuild our 120 team into this section here. We're going to scroll all the way to the right, and we can see that basically our ice types are going to be the best thing to actually go up against this team. This team is going to be weak to ice on Credilli, Victreebel, and on Pidgeot. So right out of the gate, it sounds like Wigglytuff would probably be the easiest one to lead with, considering that is going to be our best one to lead with for an ice type move. Even though we're going to be rather slow getting to it, we do have a better chance of catching their team off guard, possibly forcing a switch if we can lead with the Wigglytuff there. The next weakness that they do have, let's actually go back over here. Their next one is going to be tied basically between Flying, Rock, Steel, Fire, and Psychic. So in our arsenal for the 60,000 dust team, we have some Flying, we have some Rock, we don't really have any Steel, and we don't have any Fire, of course, and we don't really have any Psychic. So I'm definitely thinking a Flying type and a Rock type will probably work out best. Now, of course, this is just for round 1, so basically after round 1, it's gonna kind of blow open what our strategy is here. But with a Flying type, we can stick with our Noctowl there, and of course, our Rock type is gonna be the Alolan Golem. Now, what we can do here is say, well, the problem with running this team is that we're actually gonna be pretty weak to ground, but considering they're not running any ground type moves, of course we wouldn't know that, but we can look. Vigoroth possibly could have Bulldoze, so we possibly want to watch out for that. Considering that we're not leading with Alolan Golem, we should be okay with that. Pidgeot, not going to be running ground type. Wigglytuff, Victreebel, Beedrill, Credilli, none of those are going to be running ground types. So our next possible weakness is going to be either Fighting, Rock, Steel, Water, and Ice. Fighting type is probably going to be the scariest one, which means that if they can kind of see that we're going to be weak to fighting in any way, or if they just luckily guess Vigoroth, then they are going to be putting up some fighting type damage to start with. So leading with Wigglytuff is pretty strong there, not too bad. Then we're going to have the Rock type, which we're not going to be having a problem with that leading with Wigglytuff, so we're safe there. Steel type, none of those Pokemon that they have can learn Steel type moves. Pidgeot, can Pidgeot learn Steel Wing? Either way, we're not going to expect Pidgeot to be running a Steel type move if it can. So we're actually looking pretty good. Ice type is the only other problem, which if they ended up leading with their Wigglytuff as well, it's going to be Wigglytuff versus Wigglytuff, which ends up meaning it's pretty much just going to be a tie. So either way, Wigglytuff sounds like the strongest lead for us, and then we just kind of play out the match from there. We do have the best possible team out of these 3 to really counter their weaknesses. So this is kind of like best case scenario. This would be the team of 3 to start with. Now, once we get past round 1, what I personally do is I look for the Pokemon that they are really fond of. If they lead with a Pokemon, they usually like to lead with that Pokemon for a reason, even if it's just because of the safer option. That's generally something that I try to look out for. If they protect a Pokemon really strongly, like if they're using shields when they possibly shouldn't be, that's a pretty strong point there. If they switch out the Pokemon, even though they possibly are in an advantageous situation, that usually means that they're really fond of that Pokemon. Especially after round 2, if I don't win round 2, then of course I can kind of know based on their next team of 3 in that round 2 how much they do like these Pokemon. And I try to pay attention to if they really like Venusaur, if they really like Vigoroth, you know, maybe I want to switch up the team, bring in something that resists the Vigoroth, maybe something that's going to counter the Vigoroth more, you know, things like that. That's just things that I pay attention to. So now let's actually switch over, and we're actually going to run our 120,000 Stardust team this time up against our 180,000 Stardust team. So what we're going to be going up against is Vigoroth, Noctowl, Wigglytuff, Victreebel, Fortress, and Alolan Golem there. Alright, so inputting the 180,000 Stardust team into the full party here, we can kind of take a look again at their weaknesses. We can see that they're super weak to the fire type, which unfortunately we're not going to have a whole lot to be going up against that in the entire cup, so we're going to have to kind of ignore that for now. But then we do have ground type, which unfortunately on our team we don't have anything to go up against the ground type. So then we move on and we have both ice and fighting are our next two possible choices there. So ice and fighting, I would probably say that Vigoroth is going to be our safest lead here. So let's actually go with that. If we go over here, we're going to choose Vigoroth as our safest lead. Next, going back, we still do have that ice weakness there. I guess Wigglytuff would probably be the only next best thing to try to counter with a little bit of ice damage. So let's actually go back. We'll say Wigglytuff. After that, we really boiled down to rock type damage. Looks like the next best thing there. So Credilli is going to be our last slot just to start with. So looking at this, let's see what we're going to be super weak to. So we're going to be super weak to fighting and steel here. So if they lead with either Vigoroth or Forretress, we could have some problems. Vigoroth right out of the gate is going to be able to hit us for fighting type damage, so possibly Wigglytuff would be better. The problem with that is if they lead with Forretress, it could have Heavy Slam, which could end up giving us some problems there. Kind of a toss-up between the two. I possibly would probably lead with Vigoroth, considering that it's going to be a little bit easier to, even if they lead with Vigoroth itself, I'd much rather tie, because this team, the 180,000 Dust team, has a really limited number of options to go up against. It's a really strong typing team. So I think Vigoroth would be a decent trade to start with. Wigglytuff is kind of an odd one to have in the middle, but unfortunately, ice is going to be their biggest problem after they have the fighting type damage. So if we kind of disregard the ice, because ice is only going to be good up against both Knockdown and Victory Bell, if they're looking at our team, I don't know if they would possibly try to pack Noctowl. We do have a couple weaknesses to flying, so they possibly could end up leading with that Noctowl there, which could make Credilli an even more important lead. But the problem with leading with Credilli is that if we lead with Credilli and they lead with Vigoroth, pretty much going to be screwed there, because then we can't even trade. It's going to be an awkward one. It's going to be a weird one. Basically, we're going to be stuck. And I mean, fighting and steel being our big weakness here, with ice being our second biggest. Ice also clocking in there as a pretty big weakness. I mean, I'd say that's probably best case scenario going up against the 180 Dust team, considering that its typing is pretty much spread out really evenly. It'd kind of be a toss-up still between Vigoroth and Wigglytuff. I think I would probably go with Vigoroth, like I said, just to kind of tie in case they led with their Vigoroth. Otherwise, we pretty much have a lot of other things covered. If they ended up leading with Wigglytuff there, we would be at a disadvantage. Other than that, though, that one's a really tough one. That would be a really hard situation. Hopefully, we could just kind of guess right and try to think a step ahead of our opponent, but that 180 Dust team is looking really strong. So for our last one that we're going to do here, we are going to do the 180 Dust team up against the 60,000 Dust team. And the biggest problem with this one, when I originally thought of this idea, is I was like, well, that 180,000 Stardust is going to have a clear advantage. But it's kind of the only other way I can think to do this. So here we do have our 60,000 Dust team input into the entire team page again, and you can see we do have Rock, Psychic, and Ice as our big weaknesses there. So going up against that, I mean, the Rock type does sound really good to start off with, so possibly Golem being our lead. The problem that arises there is if they do lead with Vigoroth, we could basically be setting us up for failure there. Let's just see what it looks like really fast here. So Alolan Golem. Then we do have Psychic and Ice. So Psychic, we're not going to have anything to really go up against that. Ice type, I guess Wigglytuff would be the next best option, but you know what? Just because we've used Wigglytuff so much today, let's not use it. Let's do something different. So after that, we do go down and we do see Fire type. You know, we don't have anything for that. Ground type, We don't have any ground type moves there. Oh, we do have Fortress actually, so possibly running Fortress in the middle would be a decent option because Fortress could have Earthquake. And then after the ground type, we do go and see, it looks like it's a tie between Steel and then Flying. So Steel type we do have covered with Fortress as well. If we're running Heavy Slam, we could just cover that with Fortress there. So next, moving on to the Flying type, I would say that'd be pretty safe to just run Knocked Out here in the back. Interestingly, we end up running into this situation where we're not even going to have Vigoroth in this team of 3. So let's see how we did. So of course our biggest weakness here is going to be up against the Fire typing, which of course we do not have to worry about. Then we do have Ground typing, which we shouldn't have to worry about if we're going up against the Vigoroth team. If we didn't know their moves, they possibly could be running Bulldoze on Vigoroth, and that's it as far as ground type moves. So we should be pretty safe there. After that, it really comes down to either fighting, rock, or water. And Vigoroth is going to be the fighting, and Alolan Golem is going to be the rock. So if they possibly lead with Vigoroth, then yeah, our Alolan Golem here would have the biggest problem. If they leaded with rock, we should be fine as far as going up against the Alolan Golem there. So I mean, I think that's a pretty solid option to start with. And then like I said back, a few minutes ago, you basically just pay attention to how they treat their Pokemon, how they save, and how they try to, whichever ones they try to prioritize is whichever ones I try to go after. Because I know if they're going to prioritize their Vigoroth and their Wigglytuff, then I probably want to have counters for both of those, considering that they think so highly of them. I try to get into the mind a little bit of the opponent and try to think about it that way. So unfortunately, this is going to be an extremely long video. It looks like 47 minutes is how long I've been recording, Jesus. But I definitely wanted to kind of show off the information, show off a little bit of the spreadsheet to kind of give you guys an idea on how to use it. Hopefully you guys can take this information and build a really strong team. Even a budget option team is always great. So I'd love to hear from you guys down in the comments below. What are the budget teams that you guys have built this month? Which team do you think does the best on a budget? Other than that, that is actually going to be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out, of course. I do want to, again, encourage you guys to come by, hang out on the podcast. Like I said, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time is when it'll be going live. So if you're on the West Coast, of course, that's what, 7:30. And then if you're in another country, I don't know those off the top of my head. But that is actually going to be it for today, guys. Let's go ahead and roll that sweet ending footage. Well, you've made it to the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, if you do have any ideas for content, please drop them down in the comments below. I'll be happy to look at those for you guys. Of course, if you want to join my personal Discord, get to talking to some people that have a similar outlook as myself, definitely go down into the description, join that Discord there. If you want to become a Patreon, there is a link down in the description for that as well. My outlook on Patreon is I don't want to put anything behind a paywall. This is what I do. You guys get every bit of what I make, and I don't want to limit that to someone else just because they can't pay for something. I didn't think that was fair. If you want to be a Patreon, just know that you're literally doing it from the kindness of your heart, wanting to support me, and I appreciate that. You don't even understand how much. There are a couple of other options if you would like to join the community here on YouTube. It's very similar to a Twitch-like subscription where it's a dollar amount per month depending on where you live. And then that monthly fee basically gets funneled to me every month. And you do get a couple of special perks here on YouTube, like some badges and some emojis or whatever. I honestly think those are only for live streaming. So that may not be the way that most people want to go, but that's an option if you want to. Other than that, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, that link is actually going to be down in the description as well. And until our next video, guys, that should be it. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out. And until our next video, I will catch you then.